14-year-old boy murders. His mother acting untouchable until the judge delivers a chilling sentence. He walked into the courtroom like he owned it, chin high, eyes sharp, that smirk carved into his face as if guilt were a joke. 14-year-old Eli Porter didn't flinch when the photos of his mother's body appeared on the screen. He didn't blink when the judge addressed him as the defendant. Instead, he leaned back, hands behind his head, and smiled. To him, this wasn't a trial. It was attention, fame, proof that he could do the unthinkable and walk away. What he didn't know was that the same arrogance that made him feel untouchable had already sealed his fate. His sentence was written long before the gavel ever fell. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. At exactly 3:12 a.m., a motion camera in a quiet suburban hallway caught movement. A slim figure in pajamas walking with unnerving calm. That figure was Eli. In the next room, his mother, Claire Porter, slept soundly after a double shift at the county hospital. Moments later, a muffled sound cut through the night. The screen flickered. When police reviewed the footage later, they saw it. Eli stepping into the frame, knife in hand, pausing, and staring directly into the camera lens. No panic, no fear, only stillness. Then he whispered something they could barely make out. "I'm free now." And when daylight came, he walked to school as if nothing had happened. The morning after the murder felt eerily ordinary. Neighbors saw Eli walking down Maple Drive with his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. He greeted no one. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though every second of silence was his secret to savor. At school, he laughed louder than usual. His friends thought it strange, but no one dared to ask why. During lunch, he posted a photo of himself smirking beside his locker with a caption that would later haunt the entire town. "No one tells me what to do anymore." When police arrived at the Porter residence hours later, they found no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no frantic call for help. The home smelled faintly of cinnamon candles and bleach. Claire Porter was found in her bedroom, the covers pulled halfway over her body, her eyes half open in frozen disbelief. A single knife from the kitchen set was missing. Detectives noted the strange calm of the crime scene. It wasn't messy, it wasn't chaotic, it was methodical. On the hallway floor lay a single slipper, turned neatly sideways, as though placed there for effect. The television in the living room was still on, paused on a game menu, the kind Eli often played late into the night. But what caught Detective Marla Rhodes' attention was a faint red smear on the bedroom doorframe, too high to belong to Claire. At 7:02 a.m., a 911 call came in. The voice on the other end was steady, careful. "My mom's dead," Eli said. "She's not moving. I just got up." His tone was almost rehearsed, every pause calculated. When responders arrived, they expected panic. Instead, they found a boy sitting on the couch sipping water, eyes on the floor. "Did you try to help her?" one paramedic asked. Eli shook his head. "She was cold," he replied. "What's the point?" Officers took note of his spotless hands. No blood, no scratches, no tremor. The scene didn't fit the story. Something about the boy's calm was chilling. Detective Rhodes crouched near the body, studying the faint imprint on the bedsheet, a handprint in diluted blood. Later analysis confirmed what she already suspected. It wasn't the victim's. That afternoon, Eli sat in the back of a patrol car, watching his own home disappear behind a veil of yellow tape. A faint smile touched his lips. To the officers, it looked like shock. But the camera mounted on the dashboard caught it, that small victorious grin. He didn't seem broken. He seemed proud. In the hours that followed, the world outside began to shift. News stations called it a tragedy. Social media called it unthinkable. But within the precinct, Detective Rhodes called it what it was, personal. She reviewed the home's surveillance feed and froze when the motion camera captured movement at 3:12 a.m. A tall, slender silhouette glided through the hallway. Eli's build, Eli's walk. The figure moved from the kitchen to the bedroom door, pausing briefly, knife glinting under dim light. At that moment, Rhodes whispered, he didn't even think to disable his own camera. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a break-in. It was her son, the boy who believed the world owed him freedom. As dawn broke the next day, the footage was sealed, the knife sent for testing, and Eli Porter's name marked in the system as a person of interest. But when officers arrived at his school to bring him in for questioning, he wasn't afraid. He looked at them, tilted his head, and smirked again. "You can't arrest me," he said. "I'm just a kid." That moment would define the entire case, because Eli Porter wasn't just a murderer. He was a mirror reflecting something far darker. A child who believed he was untouchable right up until the world proved him wrong. The smirk stayed on his face as he was led away, handcuffed for the first time. But the faint trace of blood on his phone, the one he thought he'd cleaned, waited patiently in evidence, ready to speak louder than he ever could. The gavel hadn't fallen yet, but justice was already on its way. Before she became a headline, Claire Porter was just another tired mother doing her best. At 38, she worked 12-hour shifts at the county hospital, her life revolving around her patients and her son. Friends described her as soft-spoken, always humming, under her breath, the kind of woman who left notes in her son's lunchbox. On weekends, she'd bake banana bread and watch old movies with him. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was a steady one, until Eli began to change. The shift started small, missed homework, slammed doors, a new obsession with violent video games. Then came the lies, little ones at first, later layered with anger. He'd mock her rules, saying, "You're not my boss," with that same smirk that would later haunt everyone who saw it. By the time he turned 14, Claire's cheerful laughter had been replaced by silence. She still loved him fiercely, but that love had begun to feel like walking barefoot over glass. Neighbors would later recall the sounds from the Porter home, muffled arguments, followed by eerie quiet. Mrs. Dwyer, from across the street, remembered seeing Claire standing alone on the porch one night, arms crossed, eyes red. She looked scared, she told police, not of someone outside, but of someone inside. Yet when asked about Eli, she'd always smile weakly and say, "He's just a teenager, he'll grow out of it." But Eli wasn't growing out of anything. He was growing colder. At school, teachers noticed the shift, too. The once curious student now doodled knives in his notebook margins. He turned in essays about control and punishment. One teacher referred him to the counselor, but he never showed up. Claire was called in once for a meeting. She arrived exhausted, apologizing for being late after a double shift. "He's a good boy," she insisted. "He's just been through a lot." She meant his father's absence. Eli's father had left when he was 6, vanishing without so much as a postcard. The void hardened him. He began to blame his mother for everything, his loneliness, his life, his limits. In her phone messages, recovered later, she wrote to her sister, "He's angry all the time now. I don't know how to reach him." Her sister replied, "You always do, Claire. You always find a way." But this time, she didn't. On the last night of her life, Claire came home at midnight, her scrubs still stained from work. She found Eli awake, eyes glued to a screen, playing the same violent game for the 4th straight night. She unplugged the console. He exploded. Words turned to shouting, shouting to silence. "You need to sleep," she said, voice shaking. "I'm taking your phone until morning." He glared, teeth clenched, whispering, "You can't stop me." That sentence, the final echo of defiance, was the last thing anyone ever heard her say. Hours later, that same phone would capture his reflection in the hallway. When detectives walked through the house after the murder, they noticed the details that told the real story. The family photos on the wall, most with Eli's face scratched out of the frames. A birthday card with "Love Mom" torn in half. A notebook on his desk filled with phrases like freedom, power, and erase weakness. To outsiders, it was a home. To Eli, it had become a cage. And in his mind, the only way out was to destroy the one person still holding the key. The house itself became a silent witness. The cinnamon candle on the nightstand had burned halfway down, the wax frozen mid-drip. The air still smelled faintly of detergent and loss. One officer later wrote in his report, "It was like time stopped in that house. Everything tidy, everything clean, except the truth." Claire Porter's story ended in that small, quiet bedroom. But her life, the long hours, the kindness, the tired smile, would become the heartbeat of the case. Because when justice finally arrived, it wasn't just for her death. It was for every ignored warning, every quiet plea, every mother who ever said, He's just a kid. He'll change. Eli Porter didn't change. He evolved into something colder. And soon the world would see what that evolution looked like when it stepped into the light. The porch light outside her home still burned for days after the body was taken away. A single bulb flickering in the wind, refusing to go dark, like a final vigil for a mother who never stopped believing in her son. At 2:47 a.m., the neighborhood was asleep. The street lamps on Maple Drive cast soft pools of amber across the pavement, the kind that made everything look peaceful except inside the Porter house. Inside, the air felt heavy, thick with silence. The argument from hours earlier had ended in slammed doors. Claire's voice, once trembling with exhaustion, had gone quiet. In her bedroom, she had finally drifted to sleep, unaware that her son was still awake, pacing. Eli sat on the edge of his bed, eyes fixed on the glow of his phone. Messages from online friends blinked across the screen, laughing emojis, dares, fragments of teenage chaos. One message stood out: "Would you ever actually do it?" No reply came, but the timestamp would later matter. At 3:09 a.m., the phone camera caught a faint movement in the hallway. At 3:12, the figure stepped forward. He moved like someone acting out a scene rehearsed 100 times. The kitchen drawer opened with a soft scrape. The blade gleamed under the weak ceiling light. The sound of his mother's slow breathing carried faintly down the hall. It was the last sound she ever made. The security camera, mounted high in the corner for safety, flickered as Eli passed beneath it. He didn't even try to hide. He looked straight into it, expression flat, eyes empty, and kept walking. At 3:14 a.m., the footage glitched for 2 seconds. When the frame returned, Claire Porter was no longer breathing. The coroner would later determine 3 stab wounds, 2 defensive marks, 1 fatal strike to the chest. It was fast, silent, clinical, almost practiced, the kind of act that doesn't come from impulse, but intention. The boy lingered in the room afterward. He stood at her bedside for nearly a minute, staring at what he'd done. No panic, no tears. He reached down, brushed her hair from her face, and whispered, "I'm free now." The words were soft, almost tender. Then he turned and left. At 3:22 a.m., the bathroom faucet ran. Police would later find traces of diluted blood around the sink, faint enough to miss with the naked eye. Eli changed his shirt, placed the knife under his mattress, and crawled into bed. The next 4 hours were spent scrolling through his phone, liking posts, even commenting on a friend's story at 4:10 a.m. "Can't sleep, LOL," he wrote. By 6:45 a.m., the house looked ordinary again. Morning light poured in through the curtains, touching nothing but stillness. When Eli finally picked up the phone to dial 911, his voice was steady, almost rehearsed. "My mom's not moving," he said. "I think she's dead." The dispatcher's voice trembled. His didn't. When paramedics arrived, the door was unlocked. Eli sat on the couch, hands clasped neatly together. He didn't run to them, didn't beg them to save her. He just watched as they walked down the hallway. When one of them confirmed no pulse, he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something inevitable. Detectives surveyed the room. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints by the door, no broken windows. Everything was where it belonged, except the knife. Drawers were half open, objects scattered just enough to mimic a struggle. But Detective Rhodes noticed the pattern immediately. "Too deliberate," she whispered to her partner. "This isn't chaos, it's choreography." Then came the discovery that changed the course of the case: the motion sensor footage, the same system Eli himself had set up to record his nighttime vlogs. The camera didn't lie. When Rhodes hit play and saw the silhouette walking calmly through the hall, her breath caught. The frame froze on his face, blurred but unmistakable. His height, his clothes, his calm. At 8:05 a.m., while officers photographed the scene, Eli sat outside in the back of a cruiser, watching the flashing lights dance against his house. He didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. One officer tried to comfort him, saying, "We'll find who did this, son." Eli turned, his lips curling just slightly. "You won't have to look far," he said under his breath. The officer didn't understand what he meant until much later. By noon, the evidence was sealed, the house cordoned off, and the news vans already circling the block. Reporters called it a mystery. The neighbors called it a tragedy. But Detective Rhodes called it something else: premeditated. Because in every corner of that spotless home, she could feel the one thing that shouldn't have been there: control. And that control belonged to a 14-year-old boy who believed he'd committed the perfect crime. What he didn't realize was that every perfect crime leaves one imperfection, and his would be discovered before the day was over. It wasn't rage that killed Claire Porter. It was calculation wearing the face of innocence. Detective Marla Rhodes had worked homicide for 16 years, but this case unsettled her from the start. It wasn't the blood or the tragedy, those she'd seen before. It was the silence. The way the house felt untouched, the air still holding its breath. "It's like time stopped before he even called us," she muttered as she walked through the narrow hallway again, noting the faint smell of bleach that clung to the tile. By 10 a.m., the living room was a web of yellow tape and camera flashes. Evidence markers dotted the carpet. Crime scene technicians moved methodically, bagging the knife block, lifting fingerprints, photographing the spotless sink. One of them paused, holding up a wet hand towel. "Still damp," he said. Rhodes frowned. The murder had happened hours earlier. Someone had cleaned recently. Eli sat in the dining room, watched by a uniformed officer. He looked detached, his gaze drifting between the officers as if he were a spectator at someone else's tragedy. "You okay, kid?" one asked softly. Eli nodded. "Yeah, I just want to go home." When told he couldn't yet, he smiled faintly. "That's fine. You'll see it wasn't me." The tone wasn't defensive. It was mocking, almost daring. At 11:30 a.m., Detective Rhodes sat across from him in the station's interview room. She started gently. "Tell me about last night." Eli recited his version without hesitation. "I went to bed around 10. I woke up and she was gone." "Gone? I mean, like that." He snapped his fingers. "Someone broke in. Maybe one of her exes." "Any names?" He shrugged. "She didn't talk about them." Rhodes leaned back, watching his face. No fidgeting, no stammering, no fear. Just the easy composure of someone who had rehearsed every line. Then she asked the question that made him pause. "Do you know about the camera?" He blinked. "What camera?" "The one you installed for your videos." For the first time, his mask faltered. It was just a flicker, a tightening at the jaw, a narrowing of his eyes, but Rhodes caught it. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I forgot about that." "Most people forget after they've done something wrong," she replied quietly. That evening, forensic analysts downloaded the footage from Eli's camera. What they saw was damning. His own reflection, walking calmly through the hallway at 3:12 a.m. His phone light illuminated his face for a split second, enough to confirm what Rhodes already suspected. The still frame captured a hint of a smile. At midnight, Detective Rhodes called the district attorney. "We have him," she said, "and he thinks he's smarter than all of us." The DA sighed on the other end. 14 years old, you said?" "Yes." Then this case just became a storm. By sunrise, the local news stations were running the story. Tragic death of nurse Claire Porter. Police question her teenage son. Social media lit up with speculation. Some defended him. "He's just a kid," while others saw the truth in his stare from the released photo. The boy who looked bored in the back of a police car wasn't grieving. He was calculating. In those first 48 hours, every lead circled back to the same point. No forced entry, no unknown prints, no outside DNA. The crime had happened between 3 o'clock and 3:15 a.m. The only person awake in the house at that time was Eli. His alibi? None. His defense? Silence. On the second night, as Rhodes reviewed the files alone in her office, she found herself staring at his school photo clipped to the report. A kid in a hoodie, faint grin, eyes unreadable. She whispered to herself, "What goes wrong in a mind that young?" Outside, rain began to fall, streaking the window with thin trails of gray. She looked up, exhaustion lining her face, and murmured the words that would later echo through the courtroom. He didn't just kill his mother, he killed the one person who still believed he could be saved. By the end of those 48 hours, Eli Porter was no longer just a suspect. He was the center of a story that would shake every parent watching the evening news. The evidence was building, piece by piece, and with it, the portrait of a boy who thought the law couldn't touch him. But as Detective Rhodes closed the case file that night, she said quietly to herself. He's about to find out just how wrong he is. And somewhere in the evidence locker, a single phone case with a faint, bloody thumbprint waited to deliver its truth. The hum of fluorescent lights filled interview room 3. The clock ticked with slow precision, each second echoing louder than the last. Detective Marla Rhodes sat across from Eli Porter, who looked more like a boy waiting for detention than a suspect in a homicide. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a half-smile plastered across his face. The mirrored wall behind him reflected his calm, giving him the illusion of control. "Do you know why you're here, Eli?" Rhodes began, her tone even. He shrugged. "Because someone killed my mom and you don't have anyone else to blame." Her gaze didn't waver. "We have footage, Eli, from your own camera." He looked up, feigning surprise. "Oh, cool. So you saw the break-in?" "No." She slid a photograph across the table, a grainy still from the footage. It showed a slim figure moving down the hall, knife in hand, face half illuminated by a phone screen. "We saw you." For a moment the room fell silent. Then slowly, Eli smirked. "Could be anyone." Rhodes leaned in. "Anyone wearing your shirt, with your phone in hand?" He didn't answer. Instead, he began tapping his foot softly, as if keeping time with a song only he could hear. "I know how this works," he finally said. "You'll scare me. I'll confess, then what? I go to juvie for a few years? Big deal." The detective studied him carefully. There was no fear, no remorse, only arrogance. "You think this is a game," she said. "But games end, and this one's already over." When she left the room, forensic techs were still combing through his belongings. Within hours, they found the first piece of undeniable proof: his phone. The one with the bloody fingerprint on the case, the same thumb that unlocked it without hesitation. Inside, the messages told their own story. Searches for "how long before a body gets cold," "knife wound angles," and "how to fake a burglary." But it was the note in his phone that chilled everyone who read it, titled simply, "Ways to End It." It contained short lines, written over several weeks. "Don't panic. Clean everything. Use the middle knife. She'll try to talk. Don't listen." Every word felt deliberate, emotionless, practiced. When Rhodes returned, she dropped a stack of printed messages on the table. "Tell me about these." He glanced at them, then laughed quietly. "People say stuff online all the time." "These weren't online, Eli. They were written on your phone, in your room, hours before your mother died." He shrugged again. "You can't prove I meant it." Rhodes looked at him for a long moment, then spoke softly. "You already did." That night, prosecutors began drafting charges. But there was still debate. Could a 14-year-old be tried as an adult? The DA hesitated until he saw the video himself. The calm, the precision, the lack of emotion. "This isn't a child," he said. "This is a planner." Meanwhile, in juvenile holding, Eli seemed completely unbothered. Officers overheard him asking another teen if the news had mentioned him yet. "They're probably talking about me on TV," he said proudly. "I'm famous now." Word spread quickly through the department. The boy who killed his mother was bragging about it. The arrogance wasn't an act, it was his nature. When Detective Rhodes saw him again 2 days later, he greeted her with a smile. "You look tired," he said. She ignored the jab. "Do you feel any guilt?" He tilted his head. "She was holding me back. I fixed that." Rhodes stood, gathering the case files. "You didn't fix anything," she said quietly. "You destroyed the only person who ever loved you." As she left, Eli called after her, voice sharp and confident. "You'll see. I'll walk out of here. You can't touch me." But the law was already closing in. Every detail, the footage, the fingerprints, the messages, painted the same story. And for all his talk about being untouchable, Eli had left his entire plan written in digital ink. He didn't know it yet, but his own words were about to become his greatest witness, and when the truth spoke, even his smirk couldn't silence it. But the fifth day of the investigation, the case against Eli Porter had transformed from suspicion to certainty. Detective Rhodes called it the digital web, a network of lies, messages, and mistakes woven entirely by the boy who believed he could outsmart the system. Every device he owned became a confession. Every search he made was a roadmap to his own downfall. The first breakthrough came from the tech lab downtown. A digital forensics analyst named Curtis leaned over his monitor, eyes wide. "You'll want to see this," he told Rhodes. On the screen were Eli's deleted search terms, recovered from his browsing history. They read like the chapters of a horror novel: how to fake a break-in, how long before a body gets found, juvenile murder sentencing. He hadn't hidden them behind encryption or aliases. They were right there, typed out in plain, chilling text. Next came the chat logs. On a gaming forum, under the alias @Eli Untouchable, investigators found a string of conversations with friends. One line stood out: "She thinks she can control me forever. Wait till she sees who's in charge." Another message followed days later: "After this weekend, no one will tell me what to do ever again." It was premeditation. Not rage, not impulse, but calculation. The same thread revealed him joking about the perfect crime, describing fake break-ins and planted evidence. When the messages were read aloud in the briefing room, the silence was suffocating. Rhodes exhaled slowly. "He rehearsed it," she said. "He actually rehearsed it." But the discovery that sealed the case came from Eli's cloud account. Forensic techs found a deleted video draft saved in an auto backup folder. It was a mock news broadcast he'd filmed himself, wearing his school hoodie, narrating the details of a fictional crime. The story? A son killing his mother, then pretending to cry for the cameras. The time stamp? 1 week before Claire's death. When prosecutors saw the clip, they went silent. One of them whispered he wasn't planning a crime, he was planning a performance. The evidence pile grew higher by the hour. DNA tests matched Eli's blood traces to the knife handle. His fingerprints appeared beneath a thin film of bleach, proof of an attempted cleanup. Even the staged burglary scene gave him away. Drawers were opened in perfect symmetry, a teenager's idea of chaos. Rhodes summed it up best in her report. Every mistake he made came from arrogance. He thought he was too clever to be caught. At the press conference, District Attorney Ellen Shaw faced a wall of microphones. "This wasn't an act of self-defense," she said firmly. "This was premeditated murder committed by a minor who believed his age made him invincible." Cameras clicked furiously. Headlines erupted within hours. Teen killer filmed his own fantasy. Boy 14 charged with matricide. And the untouchable kid who couldn't hide. Parents across the state locked their doors tighter that night. Online forums filled with arguments, some blaming video games, others broken homes, others the justice system itself. But the only truth that mattered was the one buried in Eli's data. The more investigators looked, the clearer the picture became. He had planned every detail except one: the digital fingerprints that never truly disappear. When Rhodes visited him in detention to deliver the updated charges, he was sitting at a table sketching on a notepad. She slid the report toward him. "Everything you deleted, we found," she said. "Every search, every message, every word." He didn't look up. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "I'll still be out before I'm grown." She studied him for a moment, seeing the same cold detachment she'd seen at the scene. "You're right about one thing," she said finally. "You're going to grow, but not in the way you think." As she left the room, he called out, "You like this, don't you? You like chasing monsters." Rhodes paused at the door. "Only when they think they're not monsters," she replied. That night, she stayed late at the precinct, staring at the caseboard covered in photos and printed text logs. Every arrow led back to Eli, his phone, his mind, his ego. He had built his own prison, one keystroke at a time. The next step was the courts. And as Rhodes watched the news coverage of the upcoming trial, she couldn't shake the thought echoing in her head. He wanted an audience. Now he's got one. The forensic web had caught him, and this time there would be no escape, no smirk, no screen to hide behind. By the time the court psychologist met Eli Porter, his reputation had already preceded him. The untouchable boy, they called him in hushed tones around the courthouse. His case notes filled 3 thick binders, every page dripping with a mixture of brilliance, cruelty, and detachment. To the doctors, he was an enigma, a child in appearance, but chillingly adult in motive. Dr. Hannah Creel, a seasoned forensic psychologist, spent 12 sessions with him over 2 months. In her report, she wrote, Eli displays traits of narcissistic personality disorder and psychopathic tendencies beyond his age group. He views authority as performance, morality as weakness. When she asked if he regretted what happened, he leaned forward and said, "Regret is what keeps people small." He didn't cry once, not when shown photos of his mother, not when asked about his future. Instead, he asked Dr. Creel how famous he was now. "Do people talk about me on YouTube?" he wondered aloud. When she told him the trial hadn't started yet, he smiled. "It will. They'll make documentaries about me one day." The arrogance wasn't a mask. It was armor. Eli had built his identity around defiance. In juvenile custody, he bragged to other teens about how clean his plan was. "If it wasn't for that camera," he said, "I'd be home right now." He claimed he had outsmarted everyone, calling the police slow and the judge a prop. Correctional officers documented his behavior carefully. In the cafeteria, he mimicked courtroom scenes, pretending to be the prosecutor and laughing at the imagined jury. When one guard told him to sit down, he replied, "You can't yell at me. I'm the reason you have a job." Still, there were moments that gave professionals pause. Once, during a stormy night, another inmate reported hearing Eli talking softly to himself. "She shouldn't have screamed," he said. "She made me do it." Whether it was guilt or justification, no one could tell. But when staff checked on him minutes later, he was asleep, peaceful as a child. Meanwhile, the media turned his name into a national debate. News anchors asked, "Can a child be a monster?" Pundits argued about juvenile sentencing laws, morality, and parental failure. Social media fractured into camps, some demanding leniency, others calling for life without parole. Every photo of Eli's smirking face ignited outrage. One viral comment summed up public feeling. "He killed his mother and laughed about it. What mercy does he deserve?" Back in the courthouse, Judge Marcus Lane requested a private observation of Eli before trial. It was rare, but the gravity of the case demanded it. When Eli entered the judge's chambers, he didn't look intimidated. He looked curious. "You're the guy who gets to decide what happens to me, right?" he said casually. Lane nodded. "That's right." "So how does this work?" Eli asked. "Do you yell at me for a bit and then send me somewhere with nicer food?" The judge stared at him for a long moment, then replied quietly, "No, son, this isn't a show. This is your life." Eli tilted his head, smiling faintly. "Then I guess I'll give you a good performance." Later, Judge Lane would describe that meeting as the moment he understood the case's true nature. He wasn't scared, the judge told reporters off record. He was enjoying it. Like a chess game he thought he'd already won. Court psychologists struggled to reconcile his youth with his cruelty. They noted his high IQ, his cold logic, and his fascination with control. He didn't see the murder as wrong, he saw it as necessary. In his mind, the world had boundaries built by adults, and he had simply chosen to step outside them. When Dr. Creel asked what he thought of his mother now, he shrugged. "She was weak, she cried too much. People like that don't deserve control," she pressed gently. "Do you understand she loved you?" He looked her dead in the eyes. "Love is control. She got what she wanted. Now I'm free." Her report ended with a single chilling line. Eli Porter does not comprehend guilt. He comprehends power. As the trial date approached, Rhodes reread the psychological profile and felt a weight settle on her chest. This wasn't a case that ended with evidence. It was one that demanded justice louder than logic. And in that courtroom, justice would soon meet arrogance face to face. The boy who believed he was untouchable was about to learn that even a smile can't survive the weight of a verdict. The courthouse in Cedar Falls was an old building with marble floors that carried sound like thunder. On the morning of the trial, the air inside felt charged, almost electric. People had lined the steps outside long before the doors opened. Reporters with cameras, curious locals clutching newspapers, even a few students from the nearby law school eager to witness what was being called the most disturbing juvenile case in state history. When the double doors finally opened, Eli Porter entered, flanked by 2 officers. He wore a navy suit that hung slightly too big on his narrow frame. His hair was neat, his face expressionless. But what struck everyone most was his eyes. Clear, unbothered, almost bored. The chatter died the moment he stepped into view. He glanced around the courtroom as though it were a classroom, and he'd just been called to the front. At the prosecution table sat Ellen Shaw, a woman known for her unwavering composure. "This defendant," she began in her opening statement, "executed his mother with precision, then staged the scene to mislead investigators. He planned it, he recorded it, and he bragged about it." Her words echoed across the room, sharp as steel. Eli didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stared at her, his lips twitching into the faintest smirk. The jury turned their eyes toward him, as if searching for some sign of remorse. They found none. He slouched in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, eyes drifting toward the ceiling as though bored by the details of his own crime. When photos of the scene were shown, his mother's bed, the bloodstains, the knife, he yawned. Reporters scribbled furiously. One headline the next morning would read, "The boy who smirked through his mother's murder trial." But the silence that followed Shaw's final line was broken only by the scrape of the judge's chair. Judge Marcus Lane, a man known for both fairness and fire, leaned forward slightly. His voice was calm but carried weight. "Mr. Porter," he said, "you will treat these proceedings with respect." Eli looked up slowly. "Yes, Your Honor," he said with mock politeness. The hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth again. The first witness, Detective Rhodes, took the stand. She recounted the early hours of the investigation, the discovery of the camera footage, and the trail of evidence that led straight to Eli. Her voice never trembled, but when she reached the part about finding Claire Porter's body, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. "I've seen a lot of scenes," she said softly, "but that one, it felt like walking into betrayal itself." Eli turned his gaze toward her, his smirk widening slightly, as though enjoying the discomfort. When court adjourned for the day, he stood slowly, stretching his shoulders, and said loud enough for those nearby to hear, "You'd think killing someone was the end of the world or something." Gasps filled the gallery. Judge Lane's gavel slammed down so hard it echoed like gunfire. "Mr. Porter," he thundered, "one more outburst like that and I will hold you in contempt." Eli's grin didn't fade. "Understood, Your Honor." That night, the footage replayed endlessly on the evening news. Commentators dissected every movement, every word. "He's either the most manipulative minor we've ever seen," one psychologist said on air, "or he's entirely detached from reality." Inside the courthouse, though, those who had seen him up close knew better. Eli wasn't detached. He was deliberate. Every gesture, every glance toward the cameras, every smirk, all part of the performance he had promised. But what he didn't know was that Judge Lane had already begun to see through it. Behind that calm judicial expression, the judge was cataloging every act of arrogance, every word dripping with disdain. Later, in chambers, Lane told the clerk quietly, "He believes he's untouchable. That belief is about to end." The next morning, when Eli took his seat again, something in the air felt different. The tension wasn't from the press or the crowd this time. It came from the bench itself, from the quiet, watchful presence of justice waiting, patient and inevitable. As the proceedings resumed, Ellen Shaw glanced briefly at the judge, then at the boy across from her. "He thinks this is theater," she whispered. "Let's show him it's judgment." And somewhere deep in that old courthouse, the echoes of arrogance met the first notes of reckoning. The storm had arrived, and Eli Porter, still smiling, didn't yet realize he was standing at its center. The second week of the trial brought what the press called the avalanche. Evidence piled so high it began to smother even Eli's confidence. Yet, as each piece was introduced, the boy's composure only hardened. He sat there, chin resting on his hand, as if watching someone else's story unravel. Exhibit A was the knife, sterilized with bleach but not perfectly. Under magnification, crime lab analysts found Eli's fingerprints beneath the smeared residue. The jury leaned forward when the photos appeared on the screen, faint but undeniable ridges of a thumb, pressed just above the handle's curve. The analyst explained patiently how bleach hides surface oils but not the microscopic ridge patterns left in the metal's pores. The courtroom murmured. Eli blinked once and smiled. Exhibit B followed. The phone recovered from his desk, sealed in plastic. On its case, a dark, half-smeared print matched the one from the knife. Prosecutor Ellen Shaw turned toward the jury. "He touched the weapon before he touched the phone," she said quietly. "This wasn't panic, it was procedure." But it was Exhibit C that stopped the room cold, the motion camera footage. The same camera Eli had installed himself. The room dimmed as the clip began to play. On screen, a faint light shimmered in the hallway. A figure stepped forward, knife glinting briefly. The silence was suffocating. The figure's face turned toward the camera for a heartbeat. The image froze, and there it was, his outline, his posture, his unmistakable reflection in the glass of the living room television. The jury gasped. One woman covered her mouth. In the front row, Claire's sister bowed her head, trembling. Eli turned toward the screen, watching himself without expression. Then, in a move that chilled everyone present, he shrugged. Judge Lane's voice cut through the air like steel. "Mr. Porter," he said, "you may wish to consider that your lack of reaction says more than words ever could." The prosecution continued. Text messages, deleted drafts, voice memos. One file labeled Plan B listed precise times and steps, how long to wait before calling 911, what to say, how to appear calm. The digital forensics expert explained this file was created 2 days before the murder and deleted the night of December 9th. Eli leaned forward, whispering something to his attorney. The lawyer's hands shook slightly as he replied, "Don't speak unless I tell you to." But Eli couldn't help himself. "They don't know anything," he said, loud enough for the front row to hear. "It's all theory." The judge's gavel struck hard. "Silence, or you'll be removed." For the first time, a trace of defiance flickered into uncertainty. Eli looked around the courtroom, the cameras, the jury, the rows of strangers staring back. The control he'd clung to began to slip. Then came the testimony of Detective Marla Rhodes, calm, deliberate. She recounted the moment she found the camera footage and the search logs. "Every clue led us back to him," she said. "It wasn't just the evidence, it was the pattern. He planned it like a project." Shaw asked, "Did the defendant ever show remorse?" Rhodes hesitated, eyes fixed on Eli. "He smiled," she said softly. When the prosecution rested, the air felt heavier than before. The courtroom emptied slowly, whispers trailing behind every step. Outside, reporters crowded the steps again. "The evidence is overwhelming," one anchor said into her microphone, "but the boy at the center of it all still looks untouched." That night, Judge Lane reviewed the footage alone in his office. He played the clip again, the hallway, the knife, the reflection. He stopped it at the frame where Eli looked directly into the lens. There was no rage in the eyes, no fear, just calm, purpose. He closed his laptop and whispered, "There's no age for evil." The next morning, when court resumed, Eli entered the room in the same suit, the same indifferent gaze. But something in the atmosphere had changed. The weight of the evidence had shifted the balance. For the first time, the smirk on his face seemed forced. He sat down, staring straight ahead, unaware that the mountain behind him was already crumbling. Every frame, every fingerprint, every file had spoken, and together they told a truth that no arrogance could erase. When the next witness took the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't another detective or a forensic expert or a psychologist. It was Claire Porter's sister, Janine Calloway. She carried a folder of papers in her trembling hands, and as she sat down, even Judge Lane's tone softened. "Take your time, Ms. Calloway," he said quietly. Janine's voice wavered at first, the way grief makes sound fragile. "Claire was my older sister," she began. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, even people she hadn't seen in years. She worked nights so her son could have new shoes, new books, a better life. She never stopped believing he'd find his way back. Her eyes lifted briefly toward Eli. Even when he scared her, she opened the folder and pulled out a printed message. "This is a text she sent me the night before she died." The courtroom leaned forward. Janine's voice broke as she read, "He's been scaring me lately. He stares at me and smiles when I cry. I don't know who he's becoming." A murmur ran through the gallery. On the defense bench, Eli's attorney rubbed his forehead, whispering for him to keep still. But Eli chuckled, an audible, humorless sound. Judge Lane's gavel slammed once. "Mr. Porter," he said sharply, "you will show respect." Eli looked up at the judge, eyes bright with mock innocence. "I wasn't laughing at her," he said. "I just think people love drama." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the reporters stopped typing. Then came the testimony of Detective Marla Rhodes, called back to the stand to explain the text's context. "We verified the timestamp," she said. "It was sent at 11:02 p.m., just 3 hours before the estimated time of death." She paused, glancing toward the defense table. "We also recovered unsent drafts on the victim's phone. One said, 'He's in the hallway again. I can hear him breathing.'" The room felt colder after that. The prosecution presented more fragments of Claire's life. Voice messages she'd sent to friends, her diary entries, all laced with love and exhaustion. One recording played aloud captured her voice, calm but weary. "I just want him to be okay. He's angry all the time, but he's my boy. I can't give up on him." People in the gallery began to cry quietly. The words weren't just evidence, they were a heartbeat preserved in time. As the recording ended, the judge's expression darkened. He turned toward the defendant. "Mr. Porter, you were given love that most never know," he said quietly, "and you treated it as a burden." Eli stared back, unblinking. "She wanted control," he said under his breath. "She got it." The final blow of the day came when the prosecution displayed photos from Claire's room. On her nightstand sat an unfinished letter addressed to Eli. The ink stopped mid-sentence, as if her final thoughts were interrupted. "I love you, but I don't know how to reach you anymore. I'm scared of what happens if I can't." The jury looked shaken. Even the defense attorney couldn't meet their eyes. As court adjourned, Janine Calloway lingered by the exit, watching the officers lead Eli out. Her voice, soft but clear, carried across the aisle. "She gave you everything, and you gave her nothing back." Eli turned, smirk faint, but still there. "Guess we're even," he said. The words hung in the air like poison. When Judge Lane struck his gavel to end the session, the sound was heavier than usual, final, furious. Outside, reporters swarmed Janine. She said only one thing before walking away. "My sister loved him so much she ignored her own fear. I hope the court doesn't make the same mistake." That night, every news outlet replayed the text message. Viewers across the country heard Claire's final words. Her fear turned into evidence. It was no longer just a story of murder. It was the story of a mother's warning no one heard in time. Inside his holding cell, Eli lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, expression unreadable. For the first time, the cameras caught him without his smirk. He whispered something no one could hear and turned away from the light. The mother's voice, silenced in life, had finally spoken louder than her killer. By the start of the third week, the courtroom had become a stage of unraveling. The defense table, once steady with polished arguments and careful words, was now littered with notes, coffee cups, and quiet panic. Eli Porter sat in the middle of it all, still, unbothered, as if the storm raging around him had nothing to do with him. His lawyer, David Klein, looked 10 years older than he had at the start of the trial. "Eli," Klein whispered before court convened, "you need to stop talking. Every time you open your mouth, you hurt yourself." Eli smirked. "Then maybe you should start talking better." It was arrogance at its purest, delusion wearing the mask of confidence, and it was that arrogance that began to dismantle his defense piece by piece. Klein's opening plea for leniency had been based on impulse, on the idea that Eli's crime was born from adolescent rage, not malice. But the evidence said otherwise. The planning, the searches, the cold execution. And then came the final nail, the juvenile detention recording. It had been obtained legally, with full clearance, and when it played for the jury, the sound filled every corner of the room. The recording captured Eli's voice, low and amused, speaking to another inmate. "I did it right," he said. "Only mistake was the camera." There was a pause, then laughter. His cold, hollow laughter. The room went dead silent. Even the rustling of papers stopped. Judge Lane's face was stone, but his eyes carried the quiet rage of a man who'd heard one confession too many. When the playback ended, Klein buried his face in his hands. "Your Honor," he said, voice shaking, "we ask that the jury disregard—" "They can't," Lane interrupted, his tone measured but sharp. "And neither can I." For the first time, Eli's smirk wavered, only slightly, but enough for everyone to see it. The prosecution seized the moment. Ellen Shaw stood, straightened her jacket, and faced the boy directly. "You thought you were untouchable," she said. "You thought your age made you immune, but your own voice has made you accountable." Eli leaned back, arms crossed. "You think you can scare me?" he muttered. Shaw's eyes hardened. "No, but your mother's ghost already has." The jury flinched at that line. Even Klein didn't object. As the prosecution wrapped, they played the security footage one last time. Eli walking down the hallway, knife glinting, his face calm and deliberate. Then they played the audio of his 911 call immediately afterward, his voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. The juxtaposition was devastating. Eli had nowhere left to hide. Klein tried to recover, arguing diminished capacity. He brought a child psychologist to the stand who spoke about undeveloped impulse control in adolescence. "His brain isn't fully formed," she said. "He's a child who made a terrible, irreversible mistake." But Shaw countered with precision. "A child who planned the murder for weeks, rehearsed his confession, staged a crime scene, and deleted evidence," she replied. "If this was impulse, then it was the most organized impulse in history." Klein's case fell apart under the weight of logic. Every question the defense raised had already been answered by Eli's own actions. Every argument for sympathy was shredded by his smirk. During a recess, Rhodes passed Shaw in the hallway. "You've got him?" she said quietly. Shaw nodded. "He doesn't know it yet." Back in court, the final blow came not from evidence, but from Judge Lane himself. He addressed Eli directly. "You have mocked this process since it began. You've treated life and death as entertainment. But you will learn, Mr. Porter, that truth does not bow to arrogance." Eli tilted his head, feigning boredom. "You done?" Lane leaned forward, eyes cold. "Not yet, but soon." When the court adjourned for the day, the media swarmed the steps outside. Commentators declared the defense in shambles. Headlines read, "Untouchable boy faces collapse." Inside his cell, that night, Eli reportedly laughed when he saw the coverage. "Collapse?" he said to a guard. "They're the ones collapsing." But beneath that hollow laughter, something else was forming, a tremor. For the first time, the walls around him weren't bending to his control. His audience was shifting. The power he'd fed on was gone. And when the sun rose on the day of the verdict, even Eli Porter looked a little less certain of the game he thought he'd already won. The smirk hadn't vanished, but it was starting to tremble. The morning of the verdict arrived like the slow opening of a wound. Reporters filled the courthouse steps before sunrise, their breath fogging in the cold air. Instead, the gallery was already packed, every seat taken, every camera aimed toward the same spot, the defense table, where Eli Porter sat motionless, hands folded, face expressionless. It was Judgment Day, and for the first time in weeks, his arrogance seemed muted. The courtroom lights buzzed softly as the jury filed in. They moved with quiet gravity. 12 strangers who had spent days dissecting the life, lies, and cruelty of a 14-year-old boy. Some looked pale, others hollow-eyed. They had seen the images, they had heard the laughter, and now they carried the weight of justice in trembling hands. Judge Marcus Lane entered and took his seat. "We are reconvened in the matter of the state versus Eli Porter," he said, voice low but resonant. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, clutching a folded paper. His voice cracked slightly. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." Eli leaned back, lips twitching. He looked over at the jurors and smiled, small, taunting. The paper was handed to the bailiff, then to the judge. Lane unfolded it slowly, reading in silence before giving a single nod. "Please rise for the verdict." The room stood. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The foreman cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Eli Porter, guilty of murder in the first degree." The sound that followed wasn't applause or shouting. It was the quiet release of air, a collective exhale from a crowd that had been holding its breath for too long. Claire Porter's sister, Janine, covered her face and wept. The prosecutor bowed her head, and Eli laughed. It was faint at first, just a short exhale through his nose, but it grew into a smirk, then into a chuckle that drew every eye in the room. "It doesn't matter," he said under his breath, loud enough for the microphones to catch. "You can't keep me forever." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Lane's gavel struck once, then twice. "Order," he demanded. "Order in this court." The echoes swallowed the sound of Eli's laughter. When silence finally returned, the judge's eyes locked on the boy before him. "Mr. Porter," he said evenly, "your attitude continues to mock not only this court but the life you took. I will be considering this during sentencing." Eli tilted his head. "You do that." The judge's jaw tightened. "Take him back into custody until sentencing is scheduled." As officers approached, Eli stood, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves. "See you soon," he said to no one in particular, as though still performing for an audience only he could see. As the jury exited, several looked shaken. One juror whispered to another, "I've never seen eyes like that, not in a kid." Another responded, "He isn't a kid, not anymore." Outside, the courthouse steps exploded with noise. Reporters shouted into cameras. Headlines were written before the ink could dry. "Guilty, the untouchable boy finally falls." News stations replayed the verdict on loop, capturing the moment Eli's faint grin lingered even as he was led away in handcuffs. Inside the courthouse, Judge Lane stayed behind after everyone left. He sat in silence, staring at the empty defendant's chair. On the bench before him sat the note he'd written days earlier, 5 words in clean, steady handwriting: "Arrogance does not outlive truth." He folded it, tucked it into the case file, and closed the folder. That night, a storm rolled through Cedar Falls. Rain hammered the courthouse windows as the lights flickered. In his holding cell, Eli lay awake, staring at the ceiling, lips curling into that same familiar smirk. 50 years? He whispered to himself. "I'll still win." But across town, in the small house on Maple Drive, a single light burned in the window. Janine had turned it on after the verdict, a promise to her sister that justice had been done. For once, Eli wasn't the one being watched. Justice was. And it was waiting for him in the quiet, unblinking eyes of a judge who had already written the words that would define his fate. The boy who thought guilt was just a word had finally heard its meaning spoken aloud. But he still didn't understand it. Not yet. The day of sentencing began under a gray sky that seemed to hang low over Cedar Falls. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse again, umbrellas pressed together, voices murmuring with equal parts curiosity and dread. Inside, the wooden benches filled early. Everyone wanted to witness the moment the smirk finally faded. Eli Porter entered the courtroom in shackles, escorted by 2 officers. The sound of the chains was soft but carried through the silence like a warning. He wore the same navy suit he'd worn since the trial began, slightly wrinkled now, but his posture hadn't changed, chin lifted, gaze unflinching. To the last moment, he seemed untouchable. At the prosecution's table, Ellen Shaw sat beside Detective Marla Rhodes, who had come to see the end of what she'd started. Both women watched as Eli took his seat. Shaw's face was solemn, but Rhodes couldn't hide the flicker of emotion in her eyes, a mixture of anger, grief, and weary satisfaction. Judge Marcus Lane entered moments later, his black robe swaying as he approached the bench. He glanced briefly toward the gallery, filled with reporters and local residents, before settling his gaze on the boy before him. The courtroom stilled as he began to speak. "Mr. Porter," the judge said, his tone deep and deliberate, "you sit before this court, convicted of the most profound betrayal a human being can commit. The taking of a parent's life. You ended the life of the woman who brought you into this world, who worked herself to exhaustion to provide for you, who loved you long after you stopped deserving it." Eli's expression didn't change. If anything, his eyes narrowed slightly, studying the judge like an opponent. Lane continued, "Throughout this trial, you've smiled, you've laughed, you've treated these proceedings as entertainment. But this is not a show, Mr. Porter. It's a reckoning." Whispers moved through the gallery. Claire's sister, Janine, wiped a tear and nodded slowly. The judge lifted a document from his desk, the sentencing recommendation. "You've told this court repeatedly that you're a child, that you're beyond true punishment. But you were not a child the night you killed your mother. You were deliberate, methodical, and without remorse. The law cannot give her life back. But it can ensure that yours is spent in the shadow of what you've done." Eli shifted in his chair, the first hint of discomfort flickering across his face. "You can't keep me forever," he said, voice quiet but steady. Judge Lane paused, then looked him squarely in the eyes. "Watch me." The gavel struck once, echoing like thunder. "It is the judgment of this court that the defendant, Eli Porter, be sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 50 years. This court further recommends he serve his sentence in a maximum security facility." Gasps rippled through the room. It was the harshest sentence ever delivered to someone his age in state history. Eli blinked, stunned for the first time since the trial began. The smirk faltered. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. For the first time, silence reclaimed him. Judge Lane leaned forward, voice lowering to a near whisper that carried through the microphone. "You believed your age made you immune. You believed your mother's life was your property. Today, you learn otherwise." He struck the gavel one final time. "May justice weigh heavier than arrogance ever could. Court is adjourned." The officers moved to escort Eli away. He resisted for only a second before standing, his expression a fragile mask of disbelief. As he was led past the rows of spectators, Janine stood from her seat, clutching a framed photo of her sister. "You can't undo what you did," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "But at least now, you can't hurt anyone else." Eli's gaze flicked toward her. No words, no grin, only emptiness. He was swallowed by the corridor a moment later, the sound of the closing door sharp and final. Outside, the rain had stopped, replaced by a thin beam of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Reporters spoke in hurried tones, their cameras turning to catch every drop of light. Inside the courtroom, Detective Rhodes sat in the now empty gallery, her hands folded on her lap. "It's over," she murmured, though her voice sounded unsure. Because deep down she knew that cases like these never truly end. They echo. And somewhere in the quiet halls of the detention facility that would soon become his home, Eli Porter's name was already being written into the ledgers of history, not as a misunderstood child, but as the boy who mistook arrogance for freedom and learned too late that justice doesn't bend. The smirk was gone, the silence remained, and for the first time it sounded like consequence. The courthouse emptied slowly that afternoon, as though no one wanted to be the first to step back into the world. Reporters huddled under the overhang, dictating closing lines for their stories. The youngest life sentence in state history. A crime that redefined innocence. Inside, the echo of Judge Lane's gavel still hung in the air. Justice had been spoken, but peace, that came harder. Detective Marla Rhodes sat alone in the now quiet gallery, staring at the empty defendant's chair. For months the case had consumed her. Every clue, every frame of footage had lived rent-free in her head. Now there was only silence. She closed her notebook, whispering the words she'd written on the first page: find truth, protect her story. Claire Porter's story had been told, but truth rarely feels clean. It lingers, sharp, at the edges. In the months that followed, life in Cedar Falls reshaped itself around the void. Claire's house at 42 Maple Drive was sold to a young couple who didn't know its history. The maple tree out front bloomed early that spring, its branches brushing the windows where Claire had once stood waiting for her son to come home. A new porch light was installed, brighter than the last. Still, neighbors swore the house looked dimmer than before. Janine Calloway, Claire's sister, refused to let the story end with a sentence. She founded a small nonprofit called Love Shouldn't Fear, dedicated to helping single parents recognize early signs of domestic danger, even when that danger lived under their own roof. People need to talk about the quiet kind of abuse, she told a local reporter, the kind that hides behind silence and teenage shrugs. Donations flooded in after her interview aired. Meanwhile, Eli Porter began his life in prison. At 14, he was too young for the general population, so they placed him in a special wing for juvenile lifers. He spent his days under supervision, in a cell barely bigger than the bedroom where he'd once planned everything. He still drew, still wrote in notebooks, still carried himself with that same eerie calm. Guards reported he often stared at the wall for hours, murmuring to himself. When asked what he was thinking, he replied, "I'm rewriting the ending." Letters arrived for him, some from strangers, some from true crime enthusiasts fascinated by his detachment. He answered every one, careful and polite, always signing off the same way, "Still free in my mind." The warden stopped delivering his fan mail after 6 months. Detective Rhodes retired not long after sentencing. During her exit interview, she admitted this case stuck to her soul. "It's different when it's a child," she said. "You expect evil to wear a man's face, not a boy's." She moved to a quiet town 2 counties away, taking up gardening to fill the silence. Still, on rainy nights, she found herself replaying that footage, the hallway, the flicker, the reflection, and wondering when exactly innocence had died. For the media, the story lived on. True crime podcasts analyzed the psychology of the untouchable boy. Documentaries reconstructed the scene with shadowed reenactments. Viewers debated online. Was he born cruel or broken by neglect? Was 50 years too long or not long enough? The same phrase echoed through every comment section. Where were the signs? But beneath the noise, one truth remained untouched. Claire Porter had seen the signs. She'd written them, texted them, whispered them. No one had listened in time. On the first anniversary of her death, Janine visited the small memorial outside the courthouse. A handful of flowers, a framed photo, and a candle flickering against the wind. "You got your justice, Claire," she whispered, "but I wish you'd gotten your peace." Far away, in his narrow cell, Eli marked the same date on a torn calendar page. He drew a small X beside it and stared for a long time before writing 2 words beneath it, "Still untouchable." The guard who collected the page later crumpled it without reading, but the phrase stayed with him for days, like a splinter beneath the skin. Cedar Falls moved on as towns do. The porch lights glowed again, the news cameras left. The world found a new story. Yet for those who had stood inside that courtroom, one image refused to fade the moment the smirk vanished, replaced by the pale realization that arrogance has limits. In the end, justice did what love could not. It stopped him. Years passed. The name Eli Porter became less a headline and more a case study. In college classrooms and criminal psychology seminars, professors projected his photo onto screens and spoke about emerging narcissism in adolescence. They dissected his interviews, his calculated calm, his cold laughter. Students watched in uneasy silence as footage from the trial played. The boy who smiled at a murder verdict, the judge who met arrogance with law. One professor paused the video mid-smirk and said, "Look closely, that's the moment ego meets consequence." At the state penitentiary, time was slower. Eli grew taller, leaner, his face losing its boyish roundness. His eyes, though, stayed the same, sharp, calculating. He spent his early years in near isolation, drawing, reading, writing letters that were never sent. For all his talk of freedom, he lived within 10 steps of concrete, a life measured by routine and regret he refused to name. To the staff he was polite but distant. They called him the quiet one. But sometimes at night they'd hear him whispering to himself, "Still free." The world outside changed. The Porter house on Maple Drive became home to another family. The maple tree still stood strong, roots deep, branches spreading over the roof like protection. On windy nights, the neighbors said the branches scraped the siding, a sound like gentle tapping. Some swore they could smell faint cinnamon drifting from the porch, a scent that once meant safety. Detective Marla Rhodes visited that street one last time before she moved out of the county. She parked across from the house, engine off, watching the windows glow faintly from inside. She thought of Claire Porter, of the woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion for a child who never looked back. Then she thought of Eli, the boy who'd looked at a camera and whispered, "I'm free now." In a way, he'd been wrong from the start. Freedom isn't the absence of rules, it's the presence of conscience. He'd never had one. Judge Marcus Lane retired a year after sentencing. At his farewell gathering, a young reporter asked if there was any case he'd never forgotten. He hesitated, then said, "The boy who smiled at his mother's funeral." He took a sip of coffee, eyes distant. "I've sentenced murderers who begged, who wept, who claimed redemption. But that one, he believed punishment couldn't touch him. That's when I learned arrogance is a kind of blindness. It walks you straight into the wall you think you built to protect yourself." In his office, the judge left behind a single envelope taped to the inside of a drawer. It contained the handwritten note he'd kept from the trial. Arrogance does not outlive truth. Janine Calloway's foundation, Love Shouldn't Fear, expanded statewide. She spoke at schools and shelters, teaching parents how to see the warning signs Claire had seen too late. In one interview, she said, "We always tell ourselves we'd know if danger was close, but sometimes danger looks like your own child." Her words shook viewers who'd followed the case years earlier. Claire's story had become a warning stitched into the fabric of 1,000 other lives. And what of Eli? At 21, he gave a rare interview to a prison psychologist. He was calmer now, older, quieter. When asked if he regretted killing his mother, he looked down at his hands. "Regret is useless," he said softly. "She wanted control. She got it. Even now she controls the rest of my life." The psychologist noted it without comment, writing in her report, "Still detached, still untouchable in his own mind." But at night, when the guards made their final rounds, they sometimes found him staring at the small crack in the concrete wall beside his bed, eyes wide, whispering something too low to hear. One swore he caught a single word, "Sorry." Another said he saw tears. No one ever confirmed it. Years later, when Eli turned 30, parole officers reviewed his case for the first time. His file was thick with educational certificates and spotless behavior records. But stamped across the top of the final page were 4 simple words: "Remains a threat. Denied." Outside the walls of the prison, time moved on. The town of Cedar Falls grew, new buildings rising where old scars had been buried. But every few years, when crime documentaries revisited the story, the same sentence from Judge Lane resurfaced. The line that had closed his final address to Eli Porter, "Mercy is not a right you inherit. It's a grace you earn. You earned none." As the screen faded to black, the narration lingered over the image of the old Porter house, the maple tree swaying gently, its leaves whispering through the dark. And then one final line appeared, the same one that had haunted millions of viewers when the story first broke. He thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. The porch light glowed faintly in the distance, a reminder that even in the darkest stories, justice doesn't disappear. It waits, quiet and patient, for arrogance to burn itself out.